Okay, before we get into the control of breathing, I just wanted to talk about a few non-respiratory movements, which are air movement not used for breathing. So they help clear air passages or express some kind of emotion. So coughing is we cough to clear the lower respiratory tract, reflex that clears substance from the lower respiratory tract, and sneezing, hatchoo, hatchoo, reflex that clears the upper respiratory passages. Laughing, ha 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 ha, or crying emotion involve inspiring and expelling air via the group of short expirations. They express emotion. Hiccups, we don't really know why we get hiccups, but we know that it's a spasm of the diaphragm, sometimes irritation of the phrenic nerve. So when you get hiccups, what do you usually do? You can breathe into a paper bag, you can eat a teaspoon of sugar, drink some water upside down. Well, basically, we're trying to distract whatever's causing the spasm so that we can kind of say, okay, hey, forget the hiccups, go focus on something else. And then yawning, because, oh boy, whew, I bet you listening to this lecture after you saw me yawn, you yawned. It's involuntary. It's crazy, right? May cause increase in oxygen intake, but we really don't know. And it's interesting how when we see somebody else yawn, you're like, stop yawning. You're making me yawn. See, I did again. You probably yawned. All right. So control of breathing. Normal breathing is rhythmic, involuntary event, even though the muscles are also under voluntary control. So you remember the muscles that do inspiration, right? Inspiration, diaphragm, external intercostals, scalenes, sternocleidomastoid, pec minor, where they're controlled by a group of neurons in the brainstem, and they're scattered throughout two places, the medulla oblongata and the pons. And they control breathing by causing inspiration and expiration and by adjusting the rate and depth of breathing. So in the medulla, the medullary rhythmicity center has a ventral group and a dorsal group. I have a good video on Canvas that you can also look at, and it kind of explains all this if you're more of a visual learner. But the ventral respiratory group stimulates respiratory muscles and sets the basic rhythm of breathing. And the basic rhythm of breathing is anywhere from 12 to 20 breaths per minute, whereas the normal heart rate is 60 to 100, but normal breaths are anywhere from 12 to 20. Dorsal respiratory group also stimulates respiratory muscles, especially the diaphragm, involved in cardiopulmonary reflexes that control rate and depth of breathing. And the pons may contribute to the rate and depth, but it limits duration of inspiration depending on the levels of carbon dioxide and what it needs. So remember from the brain example, I told you the frontal lobe and the cerebellum, how the frontal lobe can tell you what to do, but the cerebellum will fine tune it. Well, here the medulla is basically doing the breathing, but the pons is adjusting it and doing the fine tuning of that. Okay. So here it is here. So if you look at the corpus callosum, here's the ventricles, here's the third ventricle, there's the thalamus, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, cerebellum, there's the pons, and the medulla oblongata. It has a ventral respiratory group and a dorsal respiratory group. Okay, so that's the medullary respiratory center, but you can see the nerve fibers extend down to the diaphragm here, but also the external intercostals, and the dorsal group has them in the internal intercostals, but also down to the diaphragm. So both of them reach out to the diaphragm, whereas the ventral group goes into the external for inspiratory, and the dorsal respiratory group goes into the expiratory and the diaphragm. So basically the respiratory areas, the pontine respiratory group can set the rate, help control it, and you have a ventral respiratory group and a dorsal respiratory group. They both go to the respiratory muscles, and the ventral can set the basic rhythm of breathing, and the dorsal changes in rate and depth of breathing. So they will all work together to control inspiration and expiration. Now, what are some factors that affect breathing? Well, chemicals, lung tissue stretching, emotional state, and level of physical activity affect breathing. Let's say you just broke up with somebody and you kind of gasping for air. That emotional state can affect your breathing as well. When your lungs stretch out, that can affect your breathing. So we have central chemoreceptors that are chemosensitive. Now remember, chemo means chemical, are associated with the respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata. So they're sensitive to changes in the concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions in the cerebrospinal fluid, which represents usually blood concentrations. So if either carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion concentrations rise, your pH decreases. Okay, so if your pH decreases, that means you become more acidic. The central chemoreceptors signal the respiratory center and breathing rate to increase. As more CO2 is exhaled, blood and CS levels fall and breathing returns to normal. Okay, so really it's the amount of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions that can affect our breathing pattern. Some students think it's always the oxygen concentration, but it's really the carbon dioxide that will affect your breathing. Breathing rate will decrease if carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion concentration decreases to increase CO2 level to normal range. So if I don't have enough CO2, then breathing rate will decrease, because then that means we're not taking out as much CO2, we're keeping it in, and then it will rise back to normal levels. A low blood O2 level has little effect on central chemoreceptors and must be very low, less than 50%, to stimulate them. So our central chemoreceptors are more sensitive to carbon dioxide and hydrogen. But our peripheral chemoreceptors in our carotid and aorta, they sense low blood oxygen levels. Okay, they transmit impulses to the respiratory center. In response, breathing rate and tidal volume will increase. So oxygen level plays a minor role in respiratory center, but carbon dioxide and hydrogen are the major factors affecting the breathing process. So please keep that in mind. So if I decrease ventilation, breathing less. Well, if that's the case, I'm going to have increase in carbon dioxide. My blood pH is going to go down. Chemoreceptors in the aortic and carotid bodies, sensory neurons, okay, they're going to go to the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata. Then it's going to tell the spinal cord and motor neurons to stimulate the respiratory muscles, and we're going to breathe faster. Okay, so basically, if you follow that pattern. Now, let's say we have increased carbon dioxide and then plasma, our CO2 levels. Then our chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata will stimulate the respiratory center and then back to the spinal cord and respiratory muscles, and we're going to increase again. So again, if I have high CO2 levels in the plasma and my blood pH goes down, then we're going to breathe a little bit faster to get rid of that CO2. Okay. Here's the medulla oblongata. There's the pons. Here's the carotid bodies. And then we have the aortic bodies. They measure blood oxygen levels in the peripheral chemoreceptors. Okay. Remember, the central chemoreceptors will measure the carbon dioxide levels and hydrogen ions. So now, what are some other factors that affect our breathing? So we have something called the inflation reflex. Helps control depth of breathing, triggered by stretch receptors in the visceral pleura, bronchioles, and alveoli. Helps to prevent overinflation of the lungs during forceful breathing. So if I breathe too much, this inflation reflex will limit it so that I don't keep breathing and burst the alveoli and the bronchioles. Emotions such as fear or pain can alter our breathing patterns. There's also voluntary control over breathing muscles, so breathing can be stopped for a short time. As carbon dioxide levels build up in the blood, chemoreceptors are stimulated and breathing resumes. This is kind of like you trying to hold your breath underwater. You know, you can hold your breath to a certain amount, maybe 30 seconds, a minute. You can train yourself maybe a little bit longer. But as the carbon dioxide levels rise, your brain's like, okay, silly, you're doing some silly game. I'm just going to override that and force you to breathe. So if you know who David Blaine is, David Blaine trained and trained and trained, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think he was able to hold his breath for 17 or 18 minutes. It was pretty long time. Now, hyperventilation, breathing quickly and deeply lowers the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood. This can be used to increase breath holding time. So sometimes you'll see swimmers before an event, they'll be like, get out all the CO2, and then they'll be able to hold their breath a little bit longer. So watch that during the Summer Olympics and see if you see that taking place. Now, where does gas exchange take place? Gas exchange takes place in the alveoli. Okay, the only site of gas exchange between air and blood occurs in the alveoli, which are microscopic air sacs cavities clustered at distal ends of the alveolar ducts. So they look a little bit like this. They look like little grapes. Here's the little stems. Here's the alveolar duct. Here's the alveolar sac. Here's the alveoli. Here's the blood flow. Okay. You got the pulmonary artery, which is blue. Remember, it's bringing deoxygenated blood here. And then once it's oxygenated, the pulmonary vein will take it back to the heart, the left atrium. Okay. So gas exchange will take place here, and it's usually a process of diffusion. So remember, diffusion means movement across a membrane from high concentration to low concentration. So gas exchange occurs across the respiratory membrane by rapid diffusion. Respiratory membrane consists of simple squamous epithelial cells. Remember, simple squamous is real thin. So if it's real thin, then I can have rapid exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide. If it's too thick, then I won't have rapid exchange. So the endothelial cells, simple squamous of the capillary, and the fused membranes of these layers. Okay, so that's the respiratory membrane. So if you look here, here's the cell of the alveolar wall here. Here's surfactant, and what that does is it helps increase the lubrication around the alveoli so it can open and close. Now, babies that are born prematurely around 32 weeks or so, they are not making surfactant, so these alveoli can almost stick together, and it's difficult for them to breathe. So they can be put in the NICU and given them artificial surfactant until they're ready to produce their own surfactant. You also have macrophages that reside in the alveoli to fend off any pathogens. Okay. Here's your red blood cell that's going to diffuse oxygen and carbon dioxide depending on the gradient, and I'll tell you about that in just a little bit. But let's talk about this here, diffusion across the respiratory membrane. So in a mixture of gases, each gas accounts for a portion of the total pressure. The amount of pressure exerted by each gas is called as partial pressure. So atmospheric pressure is about 760 milligrams of mercury at sea level. When partial pressure of oxygen, which is PO2, is higher in alveolar air than in capillary blood, O2 will diffuse into the blood. Okay, so if inside the alveoli I'm 104 and it's only 40 in my capillaries, well, I'm going to go from the 104 to 40s, go from high concentration to low concentration. So air is 21% oxygen, so the partial pressure is 0.21 times 760, so 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay, does that make sense? When the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is greater in the blood than in the alveolar air, okay, CO2 will diffuse from the blood into the alveolus. So let's say it's 45 millimeters of mercury, and in the alveoli it's only 40. Well, it's going to go from the high concentration to low concentration, so diffuse outside the capillaries into the alveoli, and so we can breathe it out. In a gas mixture, each gas diffuses from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. So there's a couple of factors that increase gas diffusion: more surface area, shorter distance, greater solubility of gases, and a steeper partial pressure gradient. Let me show you. Okay. So here's a great little diagram to kind of show you how partial pressure moves. This right here represents the alveolus. Okay, and here are the capillaries. So here's the venous, right, from the right ventricle. So we have deoxygenated blood. So you see that the carbon dioxide is 45 and oxygen is 40. But inside the alveoli, look, we have less carbon dioxide, it's 40, and we have a lot of oxygen, 104 millimeters of mercury. So if we want to go from high concentration, low concentration, well, of course, we're going to go from alveoli into the capillary, high concentration, low concentration, but we also want to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So from high concentration to low concentration, it goes from 45 to 40 in simple diffusion. Again, diffusion is just high concentration to low concentration movement. That's all it is. So really, through this simple diffusion, this is how exchange of gases takes place between the capillary and the alveoli. Now, what we need to do is we need to transport gases, but let's hold off on this right here.